She had 4 minutes before the line of arrivals reached the top of the staircase. And in those 4 minutes, she had to decide whether she would lie about the boys. "Tell them my name is Marsden," she said, low to the woman beside her. "Tell them I am a widow. Tell them anything but the truth." The woman, who was not, in fact, a servant, though she dressed like one tonight, only tightened the small bow at the smallest boy's collar and said nothing. Silence in that house had long been the better part of counsel. Outside, the carriages were still grinding to a halt under the portico, and the chandeliers above had been lit for what must have been the 3rd time that hour, because one of the great wax tapers near the south wall was already weeping in long, glassy ribbons that the footman pretended not to see. Inside the little side room where she stood, there was only the smell of lemon polish, the faint draft from a door that had been opened and closed too many times, and 3 boys who looked up at her with the same patient brown eyes their father had used to look at maps. She knelt. She did not mean to kneel. It was the sort of gesture she had been taught, years ago and in another life, not to make in public rooms. But she knelt anyway, and she straightened the middle boy's sash, and she tucked a curl behind the eldest one's ear, and she said, very quietly, "Whatever happens in there, you stand together. Do you hear me? You stand together, and you do not let go of one another's hands." "Are we frightened, Mama?" asked the youngest, who asked everything aloud because he had not yet learned that some questions are meant to be kept. "No," she said. "We are simply careful. There is a difference." The eldest, who was older than the other 2 by perhaps 8 minutes, and who had taken the 8 minutes very seriously ever since, said nothing at all, and only watched her face. He had her mouth. He had, she thought with a familiar small ache, all of his father's stillness. She rose. She smoothed the front of her gown, an ivory thing stitched with seed pearls in a pattern that, viewed from a certain angle, resembled wheat. She had chosen it for that reason. Wheat was a peasant motif done in a duchess's thread, and the joke, if anyone in the ballroom were clever enough to notice it, was meant only for herself. She had not expected anyone in that ballroom to be clever enough to notice anything. She had expected to be looked at and dismissed, as she had been looked at and dismissed for 7 years, and to slip in and slip out before the orchestra reached the 2nd waltz. She had come for one reason only: a name on a list, a signature she required by morning, a door that would close forever if she did not push it open tonight. She had not come for him. She told herself this twice, while the footman at the inner door raised his small, white-gloved hand to signal that her party would be next, and she told herself a 3rd time as the doors opened and the wash of light and sound rolled out to meet them like a tide. Music, glass, the murmurous sea of 100 polite conversations, all pitched at the same careful volume. Somewhere in there was the man who had once known the exact pressure of her hand on his sleeve. And somewhere in there was the rest of her life. And somewhere in there was the signature. "Lady Marsden," the herald announced, in the calm, indifferent voice of men who have learned to make every name sound equal. "And her 3 sons." She did not flinch at the borrowed name. She had rehearsed not flinching. What she had not rehearsed was the way the eldest boy's hand found hers at the precise instant the herald spoke, as if he had sensed, in the way clever children sense weather, that something in the room had just changed its pressure. She tightened her fingers around his. She walked forward. The marble under her slippers was cold even through the soles, and she was grateful for the cold because it kept her from floating, and floating, in a room like this one, was the first sign that one was about to fall. The ballroom of Castlemere House was, that night, doing what it had been built 2 centuries earlier to do. It was humbling people. The ceiling vaulted up into a painted heaven where pink-cheeked figures leaned out of clouds with garlands. The chandeliers, 8 of them in a deliberate line, hung at a height calculated to make even tall men feel briefly small. The mirrors along the south wall doubled the company, so that every guest appeared to have arrived with a polite twin. And the orchestra, set discreetly behind a screen of palms, played a slow, decorous air that nobody in the room actually heard, and nobody could have done without. She crossed the threshold with her 3 sons in a small, tidy line, and she did what she had always been good at, which was to make herself unremarkable in a crowd. She had learned the trick in girlhood, when being remarked upon had been a danger, and she had refined it later, when being remarked upon had become a sorrow. Tonight, she let her chin drop 1/4 of an inch, let her gaze settle on the floor a yard ahead, let her smile go small and friendly and entirely without invitation, and walked. The boys, schooled in this same quiet art by a mother who had taught them what the great houses had not, kept their faces still and their feet measured. And only the youngest, who had not yet acquired the trick, peeked once at the chandeliers and breathed a soft, astonished sound that she chose not to correct. It was the youngest, in the end, who undid them. He saw the sugared figs first. They were arranged on a silver epergne at the long side table, glistening like jewels under glass, and he did what any well-bred 6-year-old does when confronted with a small, glittering miracle. He stopped walking. He did not tug at her hand. He did not whine. He simply stopped and looked, and his 2 brothers, bound to him by the iron habit of triplets, stopped also. The 3 of them, in their dark blue coats and cream waistcoats, in their identical cream cravats tied by the same patient hands an hour earlier, came to rest at the side of the long table in a row of 3 small, identical heads. And a great many faces in the great room turned, as faces will when something unusual catches the light. She felt the turning before she saw it. Heat along the back of her neck. The faintest hush, the way a sea pulls back before it returns. She drew a breath. She bent toward her sons and was already opening her mouth to say, gently, that they would have figs later and must keep walking, when she felt, across the room, a particular gaze settle on her like a hand. She did not need to look up to know whose gaze it was. She had felt it before, in a chapel 7 years ago, on the morning she had come down the aisle in a veil she had embroidered herself. She lifted her eyes slowly, because to lift them quickly would have been to admit she had been waiting for them to be summoned. And across the polished floor, past the slow turn of a dancing couple, past the white shoulders of a dowager with a fan, she saw him. The Duke of Avonhurst was standing very still, the way a man stands when he has just been struck and has not yet decided whether to fall. His glass was in his hand, at the precise angle a man holds a glass when he has forgotten he is holding it. There was a woman at his elbow, dressed in pale green, who was speaking to him in the bright, untroubled voice of a person who has not yet noticed that the man she is speaking to has gone away inside himself. He was not looking at the woman. He was not looking at the room. He was looking at the row of 3 small heads beside her, and then, slowly, at her, and then back at the 3 small heads, and then back at her, and she watched the color leave his face by degrees, as if someone were drawing a curtain across him from the inside. She had imagined this moment, in the long nights of those 7 years, more times than she would ever confess. She had imagined herself cold in it. She had imagined herself gracious. She had imagined herself cruel. She had even, in her weakest hours, imagined herself forgiving. What she had not imagined was that she would feel, watching him discover his sons across a ballroom, a small, traitorous pang of pity. He took one step forward. He stopped. He did not know, she realized. He did not know which to do first, to cross the room to her, or to turn his back and pretend, for the sake of the woman in pale green and the 400 polite faces, that he had not seen what he had just seen. He stood between those two choices the way a man stands at the edge of a frozen pond, listening for the first crack. The eldest boy, whose hand was still in hers, looked up. He followed the line of his mother's gaze across the room. He did not yet know the face he was looking at, but he had, even then, an unusual instinct for matched things, and his small fingers tightened around hers with a pressure that was not quite fear and not quite question. "Mama," he said very quietly, "who is that man?" She did not answer. She had 4 minutes, again, in another sense. 4 minutes before the orchestra finished the air it was playing, and the floor cleared for the first dance, and the room rearranged itself into its second, more dangerous pattern. 4 minutes before Lady Castlemere, who knew everyone and forgot nothing, came gliding down the long room to see who had arrived under a borrowed name. 4 minutes before the Duke of Avonhurst either crossed that polished floor or did not. 4 minutes in which she would have to decide, again, what kind of woman she was going to be. She had been other kinds of women in her time. She had been the girl who said yes too quickly, in a garden in late June, to a man who could not quite meet her eyes. She had been the bride who walked down an aisle through a fog of incense and her own held breath. She had been the young wife who learned, in a series of small humiliations administered over breakfast tables and in carriage drives and at the doors of bedchambers, that the title she had been given was the only thing in that house she was permitted to keep. She had been the woman who, on a wet afternoon in November, had been told by her husband's mother that the marriage was to be set aside and that she would be returned to her father's house with a sum of money and a silence she would be expected to honor for the remainder of her natural life. She had been the woman who, 2 months later, on the narrow bed in a country inn whose ceiling she still remembered in every crack, had realized that her body had kept a secret her husband's house had not bothered to ask after. She had been, for 7 years, the woman who raised 3 boys quietly in a small white house behind a hedge, on an income she had constructed herself out of translations and embroidery, and one very patient solicitor who never once asked her to explain anything she did not wish to explain. And tonight, she had intended to be a widow named Marsden. The Duke of Avonhurst was still standing there. He had not moved. The woman in pale green had finally noticed and had turned her head to follow his gaze, and her own face, when she saw the line of 3 small dark blue coats, had done a small, complicated thing. The youngest boy, who had still not been corrected about the figs, reached up without asking and took a single sugared fig from the epergne. He turned it in his fingers, marveling. He showed it to his brother, who showed it to the third. The 3 of them bent their heads together over the small glistening thing in the youngest one's palm, and laughed, very softly, the private laugh of children who have always had only each other for an audience. And across the long room, 100 eyes followed the laugh to its source and lingered. She felt, then, a curious thing. She felt the room recognize them before it knew what it was recognizing. She felt the dowager's fans pause. She felt the card players in the far alcove lift their heads. She felt, behind her, the long whisper begin to pass from one mouth to another. The whisper that always begins in such rooms when an old story is about to acquire a new ending. And she felt the Duke of Avonhurst draw the breath of a man who has just realized, too late, that the choice he was trying not to make has already been made for him. He set his glass down. He set it down so carefully that the small chime it made against the marble side table was almost inaudible. And yet she heard it. Across all that distance, as clearly as if he had set it down at her own elbow. He turned his head once, briefly, toward the woman in pale green, and said something to her, a single, short sentence that caused the woman's mouth to close in a thin, displeased line. Then he stepped forward, away from her, and began to walk. He did not walk quickly. He walked with the measured, deliberate pace of a man who knows that every eye in the room is now upon him, and who has decided, in some private chamber of himself, that he will not give them the satisfaction of haste. He walked between dancers who had not yet begun to dance, and past dowagers who had not yet begun to gossip, and around a small, startled marquess who stepped out of his way without quite understanding why. He walked the long diagonal of the ballroom, and at the end of it stood a woman in ivory and 3 boys in dark blue. And the woman in ivory did not move, and did not look away, and did not, for 1 full second, breathe. He stopped 3 paces from her. He bowed. It was a perfectly correct bow, the bow of a duke greeting a stranger of acceptable rank, and it was also the bow of a man begging permission. And only she, in all that crowded room, knew how to read both at once. "Madam," he said. His voice was level. His voice was the voice she had learned, long ago, that he used when he was holding something in his chest with both hands. "Forgive me. I believe we may be acquainted." The eldest boy looked from the Duke to his mother and back to the Duke. His small face, lifted and serious in the chandelier light, did a thing she had not anticipated. It did not flinch. It did not smile. It simply, with the calm intelligence of a child who has spent his whole life studying the one face he knows best, reflected the Duke's bow back at him with a tiny inclination of his own head. The Duke of Avonhurst, who had been hit once already that evening, was hit a second time, and she saw him absorb the blow as he had absorbed the first, by going very, very still. "My lord," she said. She had decided, in the time it had taken him to cross the room, that she would not give him the borrowed name to his face. She had her own small pride, even now. "It has been some time." "It has," he said. He was looking at the boys. He was trying not to look at the boys. He was failing. The youngest, who had not yet relinquished his fig, held it up toward the Duke with the grave generosity of small children and said, "Would you like one? They are very good." The Duke of Avonhurst, master of an estate of 40,000 acres, holder of a seat in the Lords, veteran of 2 wars and 1 very public scandal, looked down at the small sticky hand offering him a sugared fig, and could not, for the space of 3 heartbeats, speak. "Thank you," he said at last. His voice had gone slightly hoarse. "I should like that very much." He bent. He took the fig from the small hand with the gentleness of a man handling a relic. He did not eat it. He held it in his gloved fingers as if he were not sure he was permitted to. She watched him do this, and she felt, somewhere under the ivory and the seed pearls and the careful posture of 7 years, something old and tightly bound begin, against her will, to loosen a single thread. Not all of it, not yet, only 1 thread. But 1 thread, in a knot that had held that long, was enough to alter the shape of the whole. "My lord," she said again, and this time her voice was very low, pitched only for him. "We cannot do this here." "No," he said, "we cannot." "There is a room," he said, "through the small door behind the orchestra. It is the library. It will be empty. I will go first. You will follow in a quarter of an hour, with the boys, by way of the gallery. Lady Castlemere will not notice. I will see to it that she does not notice." "I did not come here for you," she said. "I know," he said, with a faint, exhausted half-smile that she remembered from another life. You never did. He inclined his head to the boys, one by one, as if they had each been presented to him formally, and each of them, in their separate ways, inclined their heads back, and the eldest, who had her mouth and his father's stillness, said, with the gravity of an ambassador, Sir. The Duke turned. He walked away across the ballroom in the same measured pace with which he had come, and the room, which had been holding a single long breath, released it in a soft, polite murmur, and resumed its careful pretense of having seen nothing at all. The orchestra began the second air. The first couples stepped onto the floor. Lady Castlemere, in the doorway, lifted her fan and began her slow approach. She stood among her sons at the long side table, the youngest already eyeing a second fig, the middle one watching the dancers with frank delight, the eldest still watching her face, and she thought very clearly that the trouble with rehearsing a moment for 7 years was that the moment, when it came, refused to know its lines. She had not, in any of those rehearsals, given him a sugared fig. She had not, in any of them, allowed the eldest to bow. She had not, in a single one, considered the possibility that the man who had failed her might, after 7 years of silence, walk across a ballroom with his glass forgotten behind him and bow first. She bent again to the boys. She brushed a crumb from the middle one's lapel. She straightened the youngest collar. She did not, this time, kneel, because Lady Castlemere was approaching, and Lady Castlemere noticed kneeling. She only smoothed her own gown and lifted her chin a half-inch higher than she had carried it through the door, and prepared to lie, gracefully and with conviction, to one of the most observant women in the kingdom. It would not, she suspected, be the most difficult lie of her evening. That, she suspected, was waiting for her in the library. Lady Castlemere arrived in a soft cloud of bergamot and rustling silk, and the particular smile that had, over 40 years, opened more doors and closed more reputations than any single fan in London. She was a small woman, made larger by her diamonds and by her habit of placing herself in the exact center of any room she entered. She had been a friend of the late Duchess. She had been, in her time, a careful and indulgent godmother to the man who had just walked away across her ballroom with a sugared fig in his glove. She missed nothing. She forgave a great deal. She forgot only what she chose to forget. "My dear Lady Marsden," she said, taking both of her hands as if they had known each other 20 years. "How perfectly delightful! And these must be your boys. How extraordinarily handsome they are. How very, very alike." "Thank you, my lady," she said. She did not let her hands tremble. She had practiced not letting her hands tremble before older and sharper women than Lady Castlemere. "You are very kind." "Triplets, I believe," Lady Castlemere said pleasantly, as if she were remarking upon the weather. Her eyes did not leave the eldest boy's face. "How charming! One sees them so seldom. And so well behaved. Their father must have been a remarkably patient man." "He was a soldier," she said. The lie came smoothly, because she had constructed it years ago and used it often. "He had a soldier's patience." "Ah," said Lady Castlemere, with the particular small inflection that meant she had heard the lie, had filed it, and would consider at her leisure what to do with it. "A soldier, of course. And now you are widowed, my dear, and have come up to town to introduce them to society. How brave of you! How sensible! And how curious," she added very lightly, the way a cat sets down its paw, "that the Duke of Avonhurst should have crossed an entire ballroom to acquaint himself with strangers." She met Lady Castlemere's gaze. She did not look away. She did not look at her sons. She did not look toward the small door behind the orchestra, where she could just see the edge of a coat tail disappearing. "His Grace was kind enough," she said, "to thank my youngest for an offer of a fig." "Indeed," said Lady Castlemere. "How very gracious of him. He is not, as a rule, fond of figs." "Then it was kinder still," she said. For a long second, the older woman simply looked at her. The fan in her hand opened and closed and opened again. The diamonds at her throat caught the chandelier light and threw it in tiny moving stars across the cream of her bodice. "Walk with me a little, my dear," Lady Castlemere said at last, with a smile that was almost entirely warm. "Bring the boys. There is a corridor through to the gallery that is quieter than this room. We will find them a little lemonade and a window to look out of, and you and I shall have ourselves a small, civilized conversation about soldiers and figs." She did not, in that instant, know whether Lady Castlemere had decided to ruin her or to save her. She suspected the older woman did not yet know either, and was, in her own elegant way, still deciding. She inclined her head. She took the youngest by the hand. She gathered her sons. She walked, with Lady Castlemere on her arm and 400 eyes politely averted, toward the small door behind the orchestra. And behind that door, she knew, a man was standing in a library with a sugared fig still in his glove, waiting to learn whether the 7 years he had spent without her had been a punishment, a mercy, or simply the long preface to a story whose first true sentence was about to be spoken at last. The library at Castlemere House was not a grand room. It was the kind of room a great house keeps for the use of its mistress and her closest friends, lined floor to ceiling with calf-bound volumes nobody had opened in a generation, lit by 2 lamps and the embers of a small fire that had been laid earlier in the evening and forgotten. The carpet was Turkish and very old. The desk was walnut, with a single inkstand of green glass. There was one window, narrow and tall, looking out onto the garden where the lanterns hung in a long, careful line. There were 2 chairs by the fire. He was standing at the window when the door opened. He did not turn at once. He had taken off his gloves and laid them on the desk, and the sugared fig sat beside them on a folded square of his own handkerchief, like a small jewel he had not been able to part with. Lady Castlemere did not enter the room. She paused on the threshold, with the 3 boys arranged neatly around her skirts, and said, in a voice pitched for the corridor and not for the room, "I shall keep your nephew's company for a quarter of an hour, my dear, while you and his Grace discuss the matter of the figs." Her eyes were full of meaning. "A quarter of an hour, no longer. The room beyond is mine, and I do not lend it. Do we understand one another?" "We do, my lady," she said. "Good," said Lady Castlemere, and was gone, drawing the boys with her down the corridor in a soft chiming of small, well-shod feet. She closed the door behind her. She set her back against it. She did not, for a moment, trust her legs. He turned then. The firelight made one half of his face gold and left the other in shadow. And she remembered, with a clarity that almost undid her, that he had stood in exactly this way in another library, on another evening, the night before he had asked her to marry him. He had been younger then. They both had been. He had not yet learned to hold his face still. Tonight he had learned, and tonight he was using everything he had learned. And even so, she could see, in the small tremor at the corner of his mouth, that he was very near the end of what he could hold. "You named him," he said. His voice was very low. "The eldest. You named him for my father." "I named him," she said, "for the only man in your family who was ever kind to me." That my reasons and your inheritance happen to coincide is a matter for the parish register, not for us." He absorbed that. He absorbed it the way he absorbed most things, with a slight tightening of the jaw and a very long breath drawn through the nose. "And the others?" he said. "The middle is Thomas," she said, "for my father. The youngest is Oliver, for no one. I wanted a name that belonged only to him." "Oliver," he said. He said it as if tasting it. "He offered me a fig." "He offers everyone everything," she said. "It is his particular failing. We are working on it." "Do not," he said. "Do not work on it. Let him keep it." She did not answer. She could not, for an instant, answer. The library was very quiet. The fire shifted once, with a small sound like a turned page. "I did not know," he said. "No," she said. "I made certain that you did not." "Why?" She had known the question would come. She had rehearsed several answers. None of them, now, would do. "Because," she said slowly, "on the day your mother put me out of your house, I made myself a promise. I promised that whatever I had taken with me from that house, in my body or in my heart or in my hands, would be mine. Not hers, not yours, not the estate's. Mine, and I promised that I would raise it, whatever it turned out to be, in a place where no one would ever again tell it that it was insufficient." He closed his eyes. He kept them closed for a long moment. When he opened them again, they were wet, and he did not bother to pretend they were not. "I did not know she had put you out," he said. "I was told you had left. I was told you had taken the money and gone abroad. I was told a great many things, and I am ashamed now of how many of them I believed." "You believed them," she said, "because you wished to. It is easier than the alternative." "Yes," he said. "It was." It was not, she realized, an excuse. It was a confession. And the difference between the two, in a man like him, was the difference between a door closed and a door opened a single inch. She crossed the carpet. She did not know she was going to until she had. She stopped a yard from him, no closer, and she looked up into his face and she said, "I did not come here tonight to find you. I came for a signature. There is a piece of land near my father's house that I wish to buy, and the previous owner's executor is here tonight, and I had hoped to corner him before midnight. That is all. I dressed for him, not for you. I borrowed a name for him, not for you. The boys are here because I could not leave them, and because I will not, ever again, leave them anywhere." "I understand," he said. "I do not want," she said, and her voice, to her great irritation, broke slightly on the word, "anything from you. Not your name, not your house, not your title, not your apologies. The boys do not know who you are. They will not know unless I choose in my own time to tell them. I will not have them used. I will not have them studied. I will not have them measured against a portrait in a long gallery and found wanting in the shape of an ear. Do you understand me?" "I understand you," he said. "Every word." "Good," she said. "May I ask one thing?" he said. She waited. "May I," he said, For the remainder of this quarter of an hour, simply stand in this room with you and be told their names again, and be told one true thing about each of them that is not in any letter and not in any register, and then walk you back to the corridor and let you go. May I have that? I will not ask for more tonight. I will not ask for more, perhaps ever. But may I have that? She had prepared, in the long years, for many versions of him. She had not prepared for this one. This one had no defenses. This one was not asking for forgiveness, or for the boys, or for her. This one was asking, very humbly, for 15 minutes of being told true things in a quiet room. "Sit down," she said. He sat. She did not. She stood by the fire with her hand on the back of the second chair, and she told him. She told him that the eldest was called William, after his grandfather, and that William had taught himself to read at 4 out of a stubborn refusal to be read to any longer, and that William, when he was frightened, did not cry but went very still, and that the way to know William was frightened was to watch the small muscle at the side of his jaw. She told him that Thomas, the middle, had been born laughing, and had not, in any meaningful sense, stopped, and that Thomas could mimic any voice he had ever heard, and that the great trial of Thomas's young life was that he had not yet been allowed to keep a dog. She told him that Oliver, the youngest, had been the smallest at birth and had nearly not lived, and that for the first month of his life, she had slept with him against her chest because she had been afraid that if she set him down, he would forget how to breathe, and that Oliver, now, was the bravest of the three, in the strange way that the ones who almost did not live are often the bravest, and that Oliver gave away everything he loved because he had learned, very early, that things one loved were not, in the end, the things one kept. The Duke of Avonhurst sat in the chair by the fire while she told him these things. He did not interrupt. He did not write anything down, though she could see him committing each word to a memory she remembered as being unusually exact. Once, when she described Oliver's first month, his hand closed very tightly on the arm of the chair. And once, when she described William's stillness, he covered his eyes with one hand and held them covered for a long time. He did not weep. He did not, she suspected, allow himself to. He only listened, the way a man listens when he has been given, after a great drought, a single cup of water and has decided to drink it slowly. When she finished, the fire had burned down by another inch. The lamp on the desk had begun very faintly to smoke. From the corridor came the small distant sound of a boy laughing, the high, pure laugh of Oliver at something Lady Castlemere had said, and both of them, in the library, turned their heads toward the sound, and for one short, illegal second, they smiled at one another across the room as parents smile. She caught the smile. She put it away. "It is a quarter of an hour," she said. "It is," he said. He rose. He took the sugared fig from the desk. He folded the handkerchief around it with great care and tucked it into the inner pocket of his coat, against his chest. And she did not, watching him do this, say any of the things that rose into her throat. He crossed the room to her. He stopped a yard away, as she had stopped a yard from him, and he bowed, once, very low, the bow of a man who has nothing to offer but the bow itself. "Lady Mosden," he said with a faint, exhausted irony that was the first true note of the man she had once known. "I am very grateful for the conversation." "My lord," she said. She inclined her head. "Good night." "Good night," he said. He opened the door for her. He did not touch her. He did not, by so much as the brush of a sleeve, presume. She stepped past him into the corridor, and Lady Castlemere rose from a small sofa where she had been telling the boys, with great seriousness, the history of a portrait on the wall. And the three boys ran to her with the unself-conscious gladness of children who have been parted from their mother for 15 whole minutes. And she gathered them, and she did not look back, and the door to the library closed behind her with a sound so soft she would not have heard it if she had not been listening for it. She would not, for some time, allow herself to think about the small object now tucked against the Duke of Avonhurst's chest, beneath the fine wool of his coat, kept warm by the heart she had once been told, in a chapel in June, would be hers. She did, however, that night, find her signature. The executor was at the card tables. He was an elderly man with watery eyes and a tendency to nod off between hands, and she sat down beside him and spoke to him with the patience she reserved for elderly men with watery eyes. And in the space of half an hour she had not only her signature, but the goodwill of 2 of his neighbors and a quiet promise of a discount on the adjoining pasture. She rose from the table. She thanked him. She gathered her boys, who had been allowed by Lady Castlemere to sit on a velvet bench beside the card room and eat a discreet quantity of marchpane. She made her farewells. She did not see the Duke of Avonhurst again that night, and she understood, with a clarity that was not entirely relief, that he had taken himself away from the ball so that she might leave it without further notice. In the carriage, on the way home, Oliver fell asleep with his head against her shoulder, and a third sugared fig smuggled in his pocket, leaving a small dark stain on his coat that she would, in the morning, pretend not to see. Thomas, on the seat opposite, told William in a low, excited whisper every detail of every dance he had observed, complete with imitations of 3 dowagers and 1 drunken viscount, until William, who was the oldest by 8 minutes, and who took the 8 minutes seriously, told him to hush and let their mother think. She did not think. She watched, through the carriage window, the lamps of the great houses pass one by one and give way to the dimmer lamps of the streets nearer home. And she allowed herself, for the duration of one street, to remember that she had once been very young, and had once been very loved, and had once believed, with the whole unguarded weight of herself, that she would never have to learn to be careful. Then she put the memory back where she kept it, and she counted her boys' breathing, and she went home. The small white house behind the hedge was waiting for them, with 1 lamp burning in the hall. The woman who had dressed the boys that evening, who was not a servant though she dressed like one, opened the door without speaking, and the 3 boys went up the stairs in a sleepy, obedient line, and she stood for a moment in the hall, with her gloves in her hand, and her ivory gown still cold from the carriage, and she did not, that night, cry. She did, however, sit down at the little walnut desk in the parlor, and take out a sheet of paper, and write a single line in her best hand. "If you wish to know them," she wrote, "you will write to me first. You will not call. You will not send anyone. You will write in your own hand, and you will tell me, plainly, what you are prepared to offer them that is not money and not a name. When you have done this, I will read your letter, and I will consider it. I make no promises beyond the reading. I will not be hurried." She did not sign it. She folded it. She sealed it with a plain wafer. She addressed it, in a hand that surprised her by being quite steady, to the Duke of Avonhurst at his town address. She left it on the hall table for the morning post. Then she went up to bed, and she lay for a long time in the dark, and she thought about a sugared fig folded into a handkerchief against a man's heart, and she thought about a small jaw going still under chandelier light, and she thought about the particular sound of Oliver laughing in a corridor, and she thought that perhaps, after 7 years, the knot in her chest was not, after all, the only thing in her that had been tied. The Duke's letter arrived on the third morning. She had expected it to arrive on the first. She had expected, in fact, 2 on the first, 3 on the second, and a small persistent siege thereafter. The fact that it did not come until the third morning, and that when it came it was a single sheet, written close in his own hand without a clerk's flourishes, was the first thing about it that she allowed herself to respect. He wrote, he said, in answer to her instruction. He had read her line a great many times. He had considered, as she had asked him to consider, what he was prepared to offer that was not money and not a name. He had set down his answer, he said, after some thought, and he would set it down again now in plain words. He was prepared, he wrote, to offer them his attention. Not occasional, not gracious, not on his terms. The kind of attention that learns a child's habits and adjusts itself to them. The kind that arrives when promised and does not arrive when not promised. The kind that is willing to be unimportant in a child's life for a long while before, if ever, being important. He was prepared to offer them the truth, in such portions as she judged them able to bear, at such times as she judged proper, in such words as she chose. He was prepared to offer them, in the meantime, no claim and no demand. He was prepared, he wrote, to be useful or to be absent, as she required, and to consider neither beneath him. For her, he wrote, he was not prepared to offer anything at all, because anything he offered her now would be, in the nature of things, an insult, and he had insulted her enough. He signed himself simply with his Christian name. He had not done that in any letter to her in 8 years. She read the letter twice. She set it on the desk. She walked once around the parlor. She read it a third time. Then she went into the kitchen and made tea, with her own hands, and she sat at the kitchen table while the kettle muttered, and she stared at the grain of the wood until the kettle whistled. He had not, she noted, asked to see them. That, more than anything else in the letter, was the thing that stayed her hand from tearing it up. She wrote back the same day. She wrote that he might, on the following Sunday afternoon, come for 1 hour to the small white house behind the hedge. He would come as a Mr. Avery, an acquaintance of hers from her father's parish. He would bring no gifts. He would not, on this first visit, attempt to be anything to the boys but a polite stranger who had been invited to tea. He would not stay for supper. He would, at the end of the hour, go away, and he would not return until she invited him again. She added, in a postscript, that Oliver was particularly fond of currant cake, that William detested being patted on the head, and that Thomas would attempt, within 10 minutes, to make him laugh. He should not, she wrote, resist the attempt. Thomas was very good at it. He came on the Sunday. He came on foot, with an unfashionable umbrella, in a coat she suspected he had borrowed from a younger and slimmer cousin. He had taken her instructions, she saw at once, with a literalness that was almost comic. He had even, somewhere, acquired a slight stoop, as if to make himself less of a duke. She did not laugh. She permitted herself, instead, a small interior nod. He sat at her kitchen table, because she did not, that first afternoon, lead him to the parlor. He drank her tea. He ate Oliver's currant cake. He did not pat William on the head. He laughed, twice and helplessly, at Thomas, who imitated for him the precise voice of the postman, and who then, encouraged, imitated the precise voice of Lady Castlemere, which caused him to put down his cup and cover his face with his napkin for a full half-minute before he could recover. He stayed an hour. At the end of the hour he rose. He thanked her formally. He bowed to the boys. He said to Oliver that the cake had been one of the best he had ever eaten, and would Oliver convey his compliments to the cook? And Oliver, who knew quite well that the cook was his mother, said gravely that he would. And the Duke of Avonhurst walked back down the lane under his unfashionable umbrella, and did not, as he had been instructed not to, look back. He came again the following Sunday. He came every Sunday for 3 months. In the 4th month, when he had asked permission and been granted it, he came on Wednesdays as well. In the 6th month, after a long conversation conducted by the kitchen fire after the boys had gone to bed, the boys were told, in such words as their mother chose, who Mr. Avery was. They were told sitting in a row on the parlor sofa, with their mother on one side, and the man they had learned to call by his Christian name on the other. And they were told the truth in the portions their mother judged them able to bear, which was, in the event, most of it. William did the thing with his jaw. Thomas asked a great many questions, most of them excellent. Oliver, who had been holding the Duke's hand without anyone noticing, did not let go. That, when she thought of it afterwards, was the moment she dated as the beginning of the second life. Not the ball, not the library, not the letter. The small, sticky hand, already in his, not letting go. There were difficulties, of course, after that. There were neighbors to manage, and a parish to startle, and a townhouse to either open or close, and a mother-in-law, somewhere on the continent, to inform by a letter so coldly polite it might have been used to ice wine. There was the slow, careful business of teaching 3 boys what it meant that their father was a duke, and what it did not mean, and the longer and more careful business of teaching their father what it meant to be theirs. There was, between the 2 adults, no second wedding. She would not have it. He did not ask. They lived by an arrangement they worked out at the kitchen table over many cups of tea, as 2 parents who shared a house in the country for the boys' sake, and as themselves, separately and warily, the rest of the time. Whether that arrangement would, in its own slow way, become something else was a question neither of them, in those early years, was prepared to ask aloud. That is how it ended, or how that part of it ended. Lady Castlemere, who had decided, in the corridor that night, to save rather than ruin, lived to a great age and was godmother, eventually, to a small girl who arrived rather later in the story, and who was named, after some consultation, for her. The woman in pale green, whose name had been spoken in the same breath as the Duke's for 1 whole London season, married a baronet from Yorkshire whom she liked considerably better, and who liked her even more, and was, by all later accounts, very content. The Duke's mother did not return from the continent. She wrote once a letter that was burned, by her son, in the kitchen fire, in the presence of his wife and his sons, without being read aloud. The executor with the watery eyes died peacefully at his card table some years later, mid-hand, holding 2 kings and a small, satisfied smile. William grew up tall and quiet, and read everything in his father's library, and was, by 20, the kind of young man older men consulted about difficult things. Thomas was given his dog, and then another, and went into the army by his own choice, and came home intact, with a great many stories, and 1 new voice to imitate. Oliver, who had been the smallest at birth, and who gave away everything he loved, became, in the fullness of time, a doctor, and was, by general agreement, the kindest man in 3 counties, and never, in all his life, could pass a tray of sugared figs without smiling at it, as if it had once done him a particular favor. And so, by the small white house behind the hedge, in the gentle yellow light of a kitchen lamp lit against an early winter evening, the 4 of them sat down to supper, as they had sat down to supper 1,000 times by then, and the 5th chair, which had been empty for so many years, was no longer empty, and that, in the end, was the whole of it. If you have ever walked into a brightly lit room with a secret pressed close to your chest and felt the secret weigh more than your gown and your name and your courage put together, and feared, in that moment, that you would not survive the look of the one person in the room you most needed not to see, then you have stood for a heartbeat where she stood. If you have ever been the one across the room, holding a glass you have forgotten, watching a truth walk in on 3 small pairs of feet, then you have stood for a heartbeat where he stood. And if you have ever been the small, brave, sticky-fingered child who simply, without knowing it, offered the difficult grown-ups in the room the one thing they did not know how to ask for, then you have, perhaps, done more good in this world than you will ever be told. Sit with me a moment longer by this small fire. Tell me, if you would, which line stayed with you. Was it the sugared fig folded into a handkerchief and tucked against a heart that had been 7 years too proud to ask? Was it the eldest boy returning the bow? Was it the line she would not let him cross in the library when she stood a yard from him and no closer? Or was it the small hand in the parlor months later that did not let go? I should like to know. I keep these answers, as I keep these stories, for the colder nights. And if you have found your way to this fire, and the chair beside it has felt, even for an hour, like yours, then stay. There will be another story soon, on another evening, with another room and another secret, and another small, ordinary, astonishing mercy at the heart of it. Pull the blanket a little closer. Let the lamp burn low. I shall be here when you are ready for the next one. Sleep gently, friend. The fire will keep until then.